Yep.
All right, here we go.
Okay.
Hi, people. So what was the first thing?
Say, I'm going to introduce the speaker.
Oh yeah. Wait a minute.
He's my. Before you say his name, say, I'm going to introduce the speaker. Go ahead.
I'm gonna introduce the speaker.
He's
my bonus grandfather.
That's right.
He's a great storyteller, and he's an awesome dude.
All right. And what's his name?
Ian Underwood.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Athena. So, the name of the talk, licenses is the new draft cards. I'll be talking about licensing. So, when you go to pursue a livelihood, there's a good chance you'll have to get a license. You'll have to get a piece of paper that says you have permission to make a living. And there's a bunch of hoops that you have to jump through. You may have to take tests. You may have to work as an intern for somebody at low wages. You may have to go to school. You may have to do any number of things, which is really inconvenient. You have to pay fees. You have to pay taxes. But in return for all this, the state gives you protection. So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, no, the state gives protection to your customers, right? Not actually. It gives you protection from businesses and individuals who might want to compete with you without jumping through those same hoops. So, all right, I'm in charge of this now. So for a lot of people, this is really bad news, okay? So one example, let's say you're really, really good at braiding hair, and you do it in a way that nobody else does. You do it better than anybody else. It's really, you don't need any supplies. You need a comb and a chair, so you could do this at home. You could work around the rest of your life. You can integrate this. You could, rent a small space. So this is really great, and customers can come to you, and you give them what you have, they get what you want. This is how it's supposed to work. But you can't just start a hair braiding business. You have to get a cosmetologist license. And that means you have to spend $15,000 to $20,000 to go to cosmetology school and learn a bunch of stuff that you're never going to do. And then you have to work, usually for somebody you're going to compete with later, in order to accumulate enough hours. So, and since you're probably not going to do that, what that means is you won't be able to make a living providing this unique service that you have. And there are all these customers who will never benefit from the service that you're not going to be able to provide them, or the lower prices that you could charge or whatever. So this is really bad news for you, and it's really bad news for your customers. But you know who it's really good news for? People who have the licenses. Because you have to go, people who want their hair braided have to go to them, even though they're going to charge more and do a worse job. So suppose you try to do this anyway. Well, the woman in that picture actually was in New Jersey, and she got arrested. They sent in an undercover cop to have her hair braided, who came back the next day and arrested her for practicing cosmetology, not braiding, cosmetology without a license. And, her response was, it's like, this is a great quote, "What sense does it make for us to go to beauty school if everything we learn is irrelevant to what we do? You learn nothing about braiding and typically learn how to do one person's type of hair, and it's not ours." Right? So at least where cosmetology is concerned, there's some, in the whole field, there are some situations where you might cause somebody harm, where you might get chemicals in their eyes, or you might poke them with a sharp object. And so it's usual to say, we have to have these licenses to protect the customers, right? And that's cited as a reason why we have to get these licenses. But of course, this woman doesn't do anything like that. She's got a comb. She doesn't use any chemicals, and she stands behind you, so she couldn't even poke you in the eye. So where's the safety? There's no issue of safety here. And it gets ridiculous the more you start looking at licenses. So in Florida and Louisiana, for example, you have to get a license to, wait for it, arrange flowers. Because there's a lot of danger in getting a bad flower arrangement, right? So, and here's the best part of that. So you decide you want to arrange flowers and charge for that. So you go to school, you do all the tests, or you do all the work. Test day comes. So they give you the flowers, you arrange them, you put them out. So some people can come by and say whether you're good enough to get this license. And you know who those people are? your potential competitors, the people who already have the licenses. So not surprisingly, a lot of people actually fail this exam. So, as Holly Golightly would say, the mind reels. So the way licensing works, as I understand it, is it creates a kind of corral. And customers, the Cs, they can come into the corral where they're supposed to find people who have the right licenses, and businesses need to get the licenses to go into the corral, and this is where they meet each other and exchange, they engage in commerce. And this is the sort of thing that's been going on for so long that everybody just sort of takes it for granted. This is how it works, right? This is how it has to work because we can't remember any other way that it ever worked. But as many businesses are beginning to realize, this is actually a trap. And it's a trap because the government, as we have seen recently, can demand that customers stay out of the corral, to protect public health or for any reason they feel like making up. And that leaves the businesses stuck in the corral. And they still have expenses. They got to pay the rent. They got to pay their mortgages. They may have to keep a staff going. They have to pay utilities. They have to keep their supplies from rotting. So that is a really bad situation to be in, as many businesses have found out recently. But it's a trap in another way, too, and that is once you have the license, you can't operate without it. And so the threat of losing your license is actually pretty devastating. And so you will submit to almost anything to keep that license. Got to put up plexiglass everywhere? Yeah, I'll do that. Got to cut down to 25% of capacity? Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Got to wipe everything down with bleach every time somebody touches? Yeah, I'll do that. You'll do anything because you need that license, because if you lose this license, you're out of the canal, you're out of the corral, and, you're hosed. And this is exactly what we've been seeing for the last few years, is businesses submitting to nearly anything in order to keep from having their licenses revoked. So to paraphrase something I always liked from Lyndon Johnson, a government big enough to chase away your competitors is also big enough to chase away your customers. Just as a little informal poll here, how many of you have ever seen a movie? This is a scene from High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood. How many people have ever seen a movie, usually a Western, where there are some bad guys who are doing bad things, and the town or somebody hires an even worse guy to come in and get rid of the bad guys? And then they find out that the worst guy is actually worse, right? Anybody seen a movie like that? There's like hundreds of them. That's licensing. So this is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. This is when he was speaking to the truckers in the Freedom Convoy, and what he said was, quote, "If you join the protest," I don't do a Canadian accent, sorry. "If you join the protest because you're tired of COVID, you now need to understand that you are breaking laws. You don't want to end up losing your license, end up with a criminal record, which will impact your job, your livelihood." So I know it's pretty common to compare governments to organized crime, but I mean, watching him at the podium, it really reminded me of The Godfather. I just imagine him saying, it would be a shame if you couldn't make a living. And when you think about it, it's like getting a license from the state is really not that much different from getting a favor from The Godfather, because it's a trade. You get something you want now, and he gets you forever. And it's important to note, although it wasn't clear at the time, it only became clear later, that Trudeau wasn't threatening only the truckers. He was also sort of indirectly threatening anybody who might decide to ignore any law, no matter how illegitimate or stupid it is. And actually, even beyond that, he was threatening people who just annoyed him by, for instance, here's an example of a woman who donated $50 to the Freedom Convoy, didn't break any laws, and suddenly her bank accounts were frozen. She couldn't, pay money. She couldn't get her own money to get her food. And so how does this happen? Why can the Prime Minister of Canada just go to the banks and say, hey, freeze her account? Because banks need licenses too, right? And so this is the essence of the whole organized crime enterprise, is that they can tell you, look, if you step out of line, you can lose your livelihood, and you can do that with the do that with the assistance of other businesses that are afraid to step out of line. So I'm always amazed that he even would get to say something like this. And where does he get this power? How does this work? And the more I looked at it, the more I thought he sort of spelled it out right there in front of us, right? And that what he's actually saying is, if you need our permission in the form of a license to make a living or even get your own money out of the bank, we can withhold that from you until you do what we say, right? But as Jefferson once said of the Constitution, this threat contains the seed of its own dissolution, and that seed is the word if. Because the threat only exists if there are licenses. In a world without licenses, this can't happen, and that's the world I actually want to live in. So again, the favor that the the government, gives you is a license to protect you from competition, right? And it's interesting that if you go and you listen to testimony, whenever there's a bill that's proposing some new licensing scheme or to tighten up things or have more regulations, it's never actually the customers who are testifying. They're not there saying, yeah, I got this bad flower arrangement, we need more laws. It's the businesses. It's the businesses who are saying, look, I've already jumped through these hoops. I want to make sure everybody else has to too. And so, you're seeing this now with taxis and hotels, right? Because Uber and Airbnb, they're saying, hey, we have to get licenses. They should have to get licenses. And I think you're going to soon see it with restaurants. I don't know the name of it, but there's a similar thing going on where people are just serving meals in their homes. And restaurants are saying, hey, they don't have to get the licenses. And again, there's a little word that people don't pay attention to, which is if. So to me, there are two ways to think about this. The first one is basically you can say that means if anyone must be licensed, then everybody must be licensed. We need more licenses. We need more paperwork. We need more red tape. We need more control. But you can also think of it as, if there are people who can do something without being licensed, let's not make anybody get a license. And they're just, these are two different ways to look at the exact same result you want, which is to put everybody on equal footing, but only one of those is compatible with the idea of freedom. So the saddest part of all this to me is that as a rule, as I've said, these licenses are there not because customers have demanded them, because the businesses did. They're there because they offer protection from competition, or they used to anyway. And what this means is when you look around, you see all these damages, these people who have gone out of business, who have lost money, all these things have happened to these businesses. This damage is self-inflicted. They did it to themselves by being enthusiastic about this, way of doing things, which really was not in their best interests. And as usual, Ben Franklin was right. If you trade liberty for security, you end up with neither. So I called the talk Licenses Are the New Draft Cards. So why did I do that? Well, there have been dark periods in our history where we had a draft. And that meant that if you were of a certain age, certain sex, and you had a certain level of health, you would have to register and they would give you a card. And that card represented basically an unlimited claim on your life. They could just uproot you. They could send you over to another country, tell you to kill people, and they could keep you there until they got tired or you got hurt to the point where you weren't useful anymore. And so, in other words, the government could, at its discretion and without your consent, uproot your entire life. Okay, so does that sound familiar? It should. This is basically licensing again. And so I think what I hope is that many businesses are realizing that an occupational license is a similar claim. It is an unlimited claim on your ability to feed yourself and your family, which is, and it can be withdrawn. It can be withdrawn instantly. It can be withdrawn incoherently for any reason at all or no reason at all. It can be withdrawn indefinitely, right? And so these two things, a draft and occupational licensing, I think are simply incompatible with the idea of a free country. And they're certainly incompatible with the idea of a country whose stated purpose is to protect your rights and who needs your consent to govern you. Also, it just as something to note, I don't know if you can see this, just the highlighted part is the most important. It's actually explicitly prohibited by Article 83 of the state constitution, which says, that it's the job of the government to protect people from monopolies that restrain or that hinder or destroy your inherent and essential right to competition. Okay, not just competition, you're competing to give things, but also your ability to benefit from other people competing for your business. And licensing, by definition, is in fact this thing that's prohibited. So it's, it shouldn't be there, and yet it is, and that's sort of an interesting problem. So drafts and occupational licensing have this very similar underlying idea. And that is that you don't really belong to yourself. You belong to the government or everybody else, however you want to think of it. But you belong to the government as a resource that can be deployed, for the common good or to protect public health or to, preserve confidence in our democracy or to help Ukraine or whatever it is now. And in order to get that, the government may declare that your services or your products are either essential or non-essential. And it took time, but eventually, with draft cards, people figured out that the only reasonable way to deal with this was just to burn them. And honestly, this is what I would love to see, a big license burning party down at the Capitol. And I think the same thing is actually true of occupational licensing. Yeah, this is the only is what's the movie Matthew Broderick? The only sane way to win this is not to play. So here's something that I have thought about a little. If we could get in a time machine, go back, how would the last few years have been different if there had been no occupational licensing, right? And the short answer is, the government could give us advice. Dr. Fauci could stand up and say, you should wear no masks, or wait, no 2, no 1, no 3, and you should get the vaccine, or stand 6 feet, or wait, it's 3 feet? What is it now? They could give you all the advice that they want, but they couldn't punish you for not taking it, right? And what that means is they would not be able to protect us. And so we would have had to get along without certain, vital protections that we've all come to know and love, things like business shutdowns, things like this whole essential, non-essential stuff, doctors who are afraid to treat their patients because they'll lose their license for, prescribing ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. We'd have to get along without supply chain disruptions, and I don't know how we would do that. We'd have to get along without inflation from stimulus spending, shortages of nurses, healthcare workers, first responders. We'd have to get along without school closings and mask mandates and vaccine mandates and seized funds. We'd have to get along without children who are being raised without ever seeing other people's faces. Have I missed anything? Any other protections? Okay, so anyways, these are the costs of licensing. These things, these protections. And as the artist Banksy put it, I love this picture. I don't know if you can see it because of the light, but it's called Devolved Parliament. It's the British Parliament with a bunch of chimpanzees. And so the guy who painted this said, what we need is someone to protect us from all the measures they take to protect us, which I think is just a beautiful summary of the situation that we're in. And so a natural question to ask is, should we just get rid of licensing? And my answer is sort of, okay? Possibly not in the way you're thinking. We don't, when you have something that's been around a long time and you look at people who talk about things like design, they say a lot of times you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There may be some things that are actually good about licensing that you'd like to retain. And so before we think about what those might be, there are two basic arguments against licensing, which we've already sort of hit on. The first one is the moral argument. You have an inherent and essential right to free and fair competition, which it always is striking to me, too, by the way, that other rights, like you have the right to free speech, you have the right to, a warrant or to a trial, you have a right to keep and bear arms. This is an inherent and essential right. So in the hierarchy of rights that are supposed to be protected, you would think this would be at the absolute top. And in fact, it's sort of just been dissolved. So the moral argument is basically nobody can make you say please to make a living any more than they could say you have to say please to own a gun or to have a kid or to say something or to go to church or do any number of other things that are your right. I mean, a right is basically not having to say please. And the practical argument, we've been through some of this already, is first of all, licensing doesn't actually provide the promised benefits of that people will know what they're doing who have been licensed. And if you're unsure on that, I have 3 words for you: public school teachers. Second, the hidden benefits, the whole job protection racket, that only works by helping some businesses at the expense of other businesses, especially businesses that are never created, so that customers can never even use them. And so if you've ever read the great book Economics in One Lesson, it's all about paying attention to what's not seen. That's what's going on here. We're never seeing the businesses that are never created, the specialty businesses where some guy learns to do one thing really well and is kept out of it because he doesn't want to learn 100 things that he's not interested in. And third, as we have seen in the last few years, it allows for virtually unlimited government control in the name of emergencies. You declare an emergency and you've got more power than Genghis Khan. So in short, the practical argument against licensing is the cure is worse than the disease, something that applies to both licensing and COVID-19. So it's worth stopping to think or to ask, what problem are we actually trying to solve with licensing anyways? Why do we have it in the first place? And the simple answer is it's supposed to help you figure out who you can trust, right? Guy wants to put your roof on. Can you trust him? Guy wants to, put outlets in your house. Can you trust him? He wants to cut your hair. He wants to arrange flowers at your wedding. Can you trust this guy? We lived in Israel for a while, and they have an interesting system called the Hecture System. And the way because one of their big concerns is, if I go into this restaurant, will they be kosher enough for me, right? Maybe they're trying to be kosher, but they haven't really, hit that limit. They haven't made sure that all the flour has been scoured for, rat shit or whatever. And so the way this works is there is no central Israeli authority for, ranking how kosher you are. Individual rabbis go around and they develop followings, and they go around, they and their minions go around and they inspect places. They inspect food factories. They inspect restaurants. Any place where food is being produced or eaten or served. And if they think it's okay, they give you a hecture. And you can put that in your window, and you can put that on your website. You can run it in your ads. And anybody who trusts you knows that they can eat there, or they can eat that thing. And it's a beautiful system because it's completely decentralized, right? There's no central authority. You decide who you're going to trust. And these guys are all essentially competing for your trust. And what's interesting is we have similar things here. They're not as visible as they are there, because you walk down the street like in Jerusalem and there's hectures everywhere. And it's sort of an adventure to get a group of, 12 people to go out and find a restaurant they can all eat at. Because, I can't eat at that one, but I can eat at, oh, no, I can't eat at that one. True story, I worked at a company. We tried to get 12 people to go out to dinner, and we finally just had to give up. That's why we need licensing, to avoid that kind of confusion. So we have something similar here, but it's a much wider range of things. And that is, for example, we have professional societies, like the American Medical Association. And they do essentially the same kind of thing that a licensing agency would do. They monitor you to see, are you getting sued? Are you doing things right? Do you have the right training? Have you passed the right tests? This is an example of something where a mistake could actually be catastrophic. Malpractice is not something you want to take a big chance on. Same thing with lawyers. There are other professions where, the mistakes are somewhat less disastrous. Your building is ugly, your roof leaks, probably nobody's dying. You get the wrong trees in the wrong place on your lawn. The drapes clash with the rug. Or, you just snapdragons and roses. No, can't do that. So, even for the whole range of things that are very serious to things that are laughably trivial, we have these groups that have sprung up. And we have the same thing for just individual products. When you go to pick something up, you go, Underwriters Laboratory, they looked at that and they said it's okay. Oh, this has the good housekeeping seal of approval. And these guys have built up trust over decades. The good housekeeping thing, I think, has been around since like 1905. So they have a lot invested in this, and if any of these guys go around and start, certifying and approving of products that turn out to suck, they can go out of business really fast. Unlike a government agency. So if a government agency starts certifying the wrong people or just doing a horrible job, one of two things happens. One, they get a bigger budget, or 2, another agency is created to oversee that agency. So in either way, it doesn't really help. And so the nice thing about these things are they are optional, right? Certifications are optional, whereas licenses are mandatory, and that's a huge difference. It's the difference between you should do this and you must do it. It's the difference between please do this and do this or else. So here's my thought. What if we made occupational licenses optional? Okay, so the obvious response to that is, well, that's crazy, because the whole point of a license is you have to have it, right? If there's a license to do something, you can't do it unless you have the license. Well, we already actually have an example of an optional license in New Hampshire, which is the pistol and revolver license, which many of you might actually have. And what does it allow you to do? It allows you to carry a concealed handgun. But you don't actually need the license to do that. You can carry a concealed handgun anyway. So what does this serve? What purpose does this serve? Well, let's say you meet somebody, you find a classified ad, and you would like to do a private sale of a gun, or you'd like to join a gun club, or you would like to do any number of things where people want to be reassured, right? So this makes people feel better about you because it is, in fact, it amounts to a state-certified non-criminal card. So people feel better about, oh, yeah, I can sell you a gun because you're not a criminal because the state checked you out, and they would know. So this, I think, that the whole idea of an optional license, and I remember testifying that these guys going down when they were doing this and saying, you guys really should change the name because it's not a license. Now I'm kind of glad they didn't, because this is an optional license, which I think is a huge step in the right direction. So back to the baby in the bathwater. In this case, the bathwater is the fact that these licenses can be required and that there's so much damage can be done by threatening to take them away. The baby, though, there is a baby here, and the baby is the fact that over generations, some of these licensing procedures have come to be trusted by people, and they're come to be valued by businesses, right? So you actually do have this sense that, like, oh, if somebody's a master plumber, he's been through a whole process of things, and somebody's been checking him, and I can trust him to do my bathroom. I can trust this guy to put outlets in my house without burning it down. And so that's actually a good thing, right? That those things exist, and there is this system for people to know when they can trust each other. It happens to be administered by the government, which is a big strike against it because of things I mentioned, bureaucracy, there's no penalty for them screwing up. But this is good for the customers who want this, because it's already there. They know what it is. Everybody knows what these licenses mean, and they can, feel reassured. It's good for the businesses who got them because they can use this to reassure their customers. But also, the businesses that don't get them can specialize. You can just braid hair, or you could just do, certain parts, or you could do eaves on roofs or something. You could find little niches where you could do something and be the best at it, and get customers to work with you. So it actually is good for everybody except, Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, Chris Sununu, people like that who want to actually use the mandatory license as a big stick to beat you into compliance. So those people lose out, right? Everybody else actually would win if licenses were simply optional. So that's the idea. This, and I think this is actually a pretty elegant solution in that, for 2 reasons. One, you don't have to go through and do hundreds or thousands of rewrites of statutes. You don't have to repeal a bunch of individual things. And that means you don't have to get into a bunch of fights with lobbyists who come and say, yeah, I can see why floral arrangement doesn't need a license and cosmetology doesn't, but electricians, we got to have that. There's just nothing. You just say, basically, we're making it all optional, and people can actually use their brains for a while. Everything would just stay the way it is, and you just get rid of the actual problem, and as Thoreau said, there are 1,000 people hacking at the branches of evil for everyone who's striking at the root. Licensing, I'm saying, is the root. It just needs to go, not this license or that license or, brew pub licenses or whatever. Licensing. It needs to go, and the way to go, I think, is to make it optional. So we keep the good part, and we get rid of the evil part. So let's assume that I've convinced you that this is a good idea. I'm going to entertain myself with that thought. So the question comes up, well, how do we do this, right? The obvious answer is, how many people think we would amend the Constitution to do it? No, cool. Because there are 3, huh? The state, yeah, that historical document. S- Thank you. So the first problem is, as I said, the Constitution already forbids this, and so the most you could do would be to put yeah, except we really mean it. We could amend the Constitution to say that. The second problem with amending a Constitution is one of my favorite quotes from Samuel Johnson is that remarriage represents the triumph of hope over experience. And that, I think, is true of amending constitutions. And so just for entertainment, we'll look at Article 83 again, and you can see, I know the light is bad, but basically it's saying the legislators now and forever need to cherish seminaries and public schools. So what does cherish mean? I don't know. Nobody knows what cherish means. But here's the thing. You can't fund a seminary. You can't regulate a seminary. You can't operate a seminary. So you can't do those things to public schools either. So, yeah, the state, and there's this whole monopoly thing, right? There's an actual right, and there's an actual duty that are listed here, and the state Supreme Court said, well, the way we interpret this, and this is why we need judges to interpret things for us, because nobody else would come up with this. It's the state's responsibility to set up a monopoly, to fund, regulate, and operate public schools in order to hinder or destroy competition in the industry of education. And this is, amending the Constitution, I just think it's a crapshoot, right? You're as likely to get the opposite of what you wanted as what you actually were trying to get. And this is why I like to say, friends, do not let friends amend constitutions. So the third problem is, and I find this almost unbelievable, legislatures, apparently our state legislature believes that statutes control constitutions rather than the other way around. And I learned this. I came down in 2015 to testify against a gun control bill and mentioned, as I like to, that what time is it? Oh. I like to mention that the Article 2A says that all persons have the right to keep and bear arms, not persons who have met certain qualifications or persons who don't scare us or persons who have reached a certain age. It's all persons. If you're a person, that's your qualification. And they were discussing this in executive committee the next day, and a friend of mine was in there, and she said they were talking about my testimony, and this state senator, David Pierce, said, well, I think he's saying that gun control laws are all unconstitutional, but they can't be unconstitutional because we have them. Which again, the mind reels, the logic they're using. So if we pass a statute and it contradicts the Constitution, it's not the statute that's wrong, it's the Constitution. So again, you work with what you have. And so if constitutions are irrelevant and statutes are what people pay attention to, here's a simple one. This is a one-line RSA, right? All occupational licenses issued by the state of New Hampshire shall be optional. You don't have to change anything else. You just do this. And I'm hoping today, my Jedi mind trick, that there are legislators out there, representatives, senators, who will go and run with this and actually say, start this conversation, even if you know it's not going to pass this year or next year or the year after. Start the conversation. The way the conversation got started with constitutional carry, the way the conversation is going on with recreational marijuana. If you don't start talking about it, never going to happen. So that's what I would like to see happen. So another question is, why now? Why would we do this right now? And I think it's because one of the silver linings of COVID is that the true cost of licensing, as I said, has not become apparent to businesses until now, until recently, when they're actually seeing the cost of having got that favor from the government. And now this is out in the open, and I'm actually... I have to believe, I have to be optimistic about this, that if there was an effort to just make all licensing optional, you wouldn't have businesses showing up fighting to keep those licenses, because now they actually know what that means for them. So what do we do until then? Okay, this is the weird part of the talk. So while we're making licensing optional in the law, which may take a little time, I think we have to make it optional in practice. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are several classic stories The Velveteen Rabbit, my favorite, Pinocchio, The Magic City, in which there are toys that become real through some process, right? So I would ask, well, what makes you a toy? You're a toy if somebody else makes decisions for you, right? So that part of the kid decides when you're going to be played with, how much, in what way, and you exist for his sake. And if he decides that you're no longer essential, he puts you aside, maybe in the closet for later, maybe in the trash for good. So by contrast, what makes you real? Well, you're real if you make your own decisions. You decide what you'll do and how you'll do it, and you exist for your sake, okay? And a business that believes it needs a license to operate in this sense is a toy. It can be declared non-essential and just set aside by politicians and bureaucrats when they're no longer interested in it. So the thing about the word essential, which I like to point out to people when we talk about it, is it really only makes sense in context. That is, nothing's essential. Something is essential to something or to someone, right? So amino acids, essential amino acids. They're not essential unless you can't produce them in your body. Then they're essential to you, but they're not essential to, say, another animal that can make them. So in the same way, permission to do something is only essential to people who can't give it to themselves. They have to get it from somewhere else outside. And this is why the Declaration of Independence, by the way, was called a declaration. It wasn't the petition for independence. It wasn't the request for independence. It was the declaration. We're not asking. We're telling. So a business that operates only if it's considered essential by the state isn't real. It's a toy. A business that operates because it's essential to itself and its customers, that's a real business. And we've seen examples of businesses becoming real. So my favorite one early on in this was a brew pub in Maine. I forget the name, but the pub was told to close down. And they said, no, we're staying open. And so the state took away its health and liquor licenses and started piling up fines for operating without a license. And the owner was like, you know what, I can't do this. I am going to lose all this money. So he was going to quit, and something magic happened. So the next day when he was going to quit, like 150 people showed up to go to the pub. And when the fines were piling up, 600 people contributed to a GoFundMe, which might not work anymore, but to pay his fines so he could stay open. So he could say, I don't need the license. If you're going to steal my money, you can steal my money, but I'm going to stay open, and my customers want to come here because they love me. And this is, the Skin Horse explains this to the Velveteen Rabbit. He says, real isn't how you're made. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, you become real. So to be essential, you need the permission of the state. And to be real, you need the love and support of your customers. You also need to be able to do something if cops show up, right? And so not too long ago, my wife, Jody, came back from a rally in Concord that had something to do with COVID, I'm sure. And she asked a question that I thought was really interesting and instructive. And it was, so if the police are willing to go around and hassle moms and kids on playgrounds, why didn't they come to this rally and tell everybody to go home? Do you think it could have something to do with the fact that so many people there were armed? Some of them conspicuously so? And so here's my little dream. Imagine somewhere in New Hampshire, there's a restaurant or a hair salon or gym or clothing store, whatever, and it opens without permission from the state. There are no licenses to revoke because none were issued, and the state tells it to close, and it stays open anyway. And customers show up, armed, some conspicuously so. And then the police show up to shut it down, and customers refuse to leave. So the question is, what do you suppose would happen? Or what do you suppose wouldn't happen? That would be a business becoming not essential, but real. And as the Skin Horse explained, once you're real, you can't become unreal again. It's forever. So I want to close with just this thought. Something Milton Friedman said that I find very inspiring is, he would write all these ideas and people go, that's never going to happen, that's never going to happen. And he said, look, that's not my job. My job isn't to get people to go out and implement these ideas. My job is to have these ideas around so when a crisis occurs and people are looking around for ideas because they don't know what to do, they're here and they can find them, right? And so his point was, in a crisis, what up to a certain point seemed impossible suddenly becomes inevitable. And I agree with him, and I think it's important to get the ideas out there, even if it could be a long time before they're used. I do, however, as I said, believe that we are actually in one of those times when what would have been impossible 4 years ago might suddenly become inevitable because enough businesses have been beaten down enough that they're going to actually see how that balance works out. And so, if COVID's taught us anything, and I hope it has, I hope we learn something from this, it's whatever good that we imagine is coming from occupational licensing, which in the end is always about protecting jobs rather than protecting anybody. It doesn't begin to compare to the evil that's been done, that it has enabled in the hands of government officials who claim that public health trumps everything and are willing to pull licenses in order to crush anyone who disagrees with them. And I'm hoping that even business owners can see this now. And I think we've never had this kind of opportunity before, and it may be a long time before we see it again. So here are 3 ideas I want to leave you with. 1, occupational licensing needs to die if liberty is going to live. 2, the simplest way for that to happen, at least in New Hampshire, is to just make it optional. And 3, until that happens, it's the job of customers to love toy businesses enough to make them real. Thank you. We have time for questions, I guess. Questions?
We have about 5 minutes for questions, so come up to this mic and be brief. Set a timer. Shut me off. Anyways, you had mentioned that they own you forever. Well, I spent a lot of hours studying the Massachusetts Civil Code, which all the states have adopted as Uniform Commercial Code type of thing. That's what in Massachusetts they call it an MGL. New Hampshire they call it a Revised Statute Annotated. But in MGL Chapter 93.5, Section A, it says any person who applies for a license to operate a motor vehicle gives irrevocable power of attorney to the Registrar of Motor Vehicles. So when I was 19 years old, I got busted with a group of guys. One guy's dirt bike broke down, so we stopped to help, and it was sore on the road, and we all got arrested. I was the only one the charges were dismissed the first day at court because I'm like, what evidence do you have that subjects me to your jurisdiction? And they said, well, you have a driver's license, right? And I says, no. And he says to the prosecutor, can you verify this guy doesn't have a driver's license? And they're like, yeah, he was charged with operating without a driver's license. But everybody else was charged operating unregistered, uninsured, and whatever on an ATV on a public way. And so mine was totally dismissed. A lot of those guys were like, holy crap, how'd you do that? But, I never subjected myself to their jurisdiction. I refer to licenses as jurisdictional traps. And when you get a license, like if I got a gun license, or if I had to get a license for some reason, because you're not going to get electricity at your house without a license from the town, I would attach an affidavit to the license stating I reserve all rights, I don't surrender any rights, I exercise all of my rights and claim all of my rights all the time. Actually, I'd put about 15 pages worth of supporting authorities and documents in it, maybe even 100. Why not? Because it's all going to be evidence in a courtroom if they deny you.
Right.
So,
no, it's good. And for people who have the patience and to wade through things like the Uniform Commercial Code, I would highly recommend that. I'm looking for a simpler solution. Yes.
Just very shortly, I wanted to thank you for a very nice and inspiring and beautiful talk. And I also wanted to know, do you have a license to give public speaking?
I burned it. Anyone else? Oh, yeah. Okay.
As with the others, I don't really have a question, but there are similar things to what you're talking about. For instance, motion picture ratings. Those are voluntary. You can change the movie if you want to. And it's mostly made for the theaters because they kept getting parents coming in and say, well, you shouldn't have shown this video, this movie to my kids who were under a certain age. So they're all voluntary, and the makers of the movie can ask for another one, or they can just say, we refuse the rating, and it's called NR. And it might not be anything really bad. It could be a children's video, but they refuse the rating.
Yeah. Yeah, and it puts it back on the parents to figure it out. Talk to people, ask people. It's like, I had somebody was in some discussion on an internet in Discus, I think, and they were like, well, what if you get a moron for an electrician? And I'm like, okay, that's really your argument? Like, ask people if he's a moron. Take some responsibility.
So I have a question. Is there a angle to licensing where the license protects you from the customer in the sense of lawsuits?
That's a really good question. I know that pharmaceutical companies can't be sued under certain circumstances. And I think it would not surprise me if that exists, and that to me would fall under the concept of regulatory capture, which I don't know how many people are familiar with that. Okay, this is a really important thing to know. So if you are trying to regulate an industry and you're a legislature and you don't know anything about the industry, that doesn't stop you. What you do is you go out and hire some people who actually know something about the industry. So where do those people come from? They come from the industry. So you end up with the industry writing the regulations to govern the industry, which means the industry has effectively captured the regulatory process. It is, it's what Aesop would call putting the foxes in charge of the hen house. So it would not surprise me that would be, I know that you buy things and there are contracts that say you will submit to arbitration. You can't sue them. So yes, I think in highly regulated environments, the companies do whatever they can to protect themselves from you in addition to other competitors. Yeah, sure.
Because I was wondering whether that would kind of limit things where if I'm a doctor and I'm going to do my best, but obviously I can make a mistake, and then you can sue me and say, I didn't do a good job because I should have known that would be a problem.
Yeah.
But as long as I could defend myself saying, well, I did what my certification told me to do, you present that in court and then they say, well, you're off the hook because even though it was bad, the government told me it was good. So
my understanding is a lot of the regulatory boards and agencies have the power to pull if you make a mistake, you do something terrible, they can say, well, we'll take away your license to practice medicine, but they don't punish you. That's a civil matter. Somebody would sue you. And like I said, gun companies are under certain circumstances can't be sued for actually making a product that works the way they say they're going to work, right? And pharmaceutical companies can't be sued for making vaccines because nobody would insure them. So there is a lot of stuff going on, and I will just say it wouldn't surprise me to find that those kinds of regulations are in place that I don't know about. But yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you very much.